Well, hey, it's Tuesday. I'm a little late today. I don't think anyone really cares. I apologize to the 1 to 2 people who watch these things live. People are pretty nice about watching them recorded, which, you can easily get if you go to kube.io/Tanzu Talk. Anyhow, today I had, I fixed this from yesterday. I realized that I actually had the head and screen thing. But today I want to go over, I came up with a couple of things here to go over. One, I had a long discussion with a couple of people yesterday about, I don't know, what the point of all this Tanzu and cloud native stuff is. And my position, I was trying to get my son to be a guest today, but I guess I've just got this dog. Anyways, my theory or way of framing it was that it's all about bottleneck removal on the way to getting software out the door and running it. Improving your software supply chain, as every now and then we say in Tanzu land. And next, I wanted to go over a section from my most recent book, the Business Bottleneck. Speaking of bottlenecks, I didn't even think of that. Just a little bit of kind of some musing, as it were, about how I've been trying to think about how you get strategy, corporate strategy, more involved in the whole like software as a product, digital transformation sort of stuff. And having some firsthand experience with strategy and also consulting with strategy people, I don't know. I always have a lot of thoughts on strategy stuff. If you remember from yesterday, I was bemoaning how in a lot of corporate settings, there doesn't seem to really be tools or process that people use. And I think strategy is an interesting area there. A lot of models, but it's not quite as engineered as I would expect things to be. And then we'll see if I get to it. But, I work at a large company. I work with a lot of just those kind of institutions that people do. And I have encounters with policy a lot. And I think, policy is close to a lot of governance concerns that we have. And I think there's kind of a more humane way to think about policy. And I would suggest that in my experience, policy is all about basically a roundabout way of telling people no. This is not always the case. It's often, especially recently, used to make things better, to kind of make explicit morals and norms that should be explicit. But there's a whole other type of policy that, I don't know, seems to not be helpful. So anyways, before I get to that, I was thinking maybe I should spread your CTA throughout the actual video. Are you interested in Kubernetes? Do you want to learn more about it? You know what you should do? You should open up your web browser and you should go over to kube.academy. And what you can find there is all sorts of learning materials. Look at that. You got good old Joe there hanging out. But there's all sorts of self-directed courses you can go through to learn not only about what Kubernetes is and how to administer it, but there's some of the more, kind of, I wouldn't say advanced, but sort of like, what do you do with it? How do you wrap your strategy around it? How do you, there's one in particular that just came out. I forget where it is, but it's sort of like thinking about Kubernetes from a development standpoint and things like that. But you should go check it out. It's all free. It uses one of these wacky new top-level domains, TLDs. .academy. But if you just go to kube.academy, you can check that out and see what my VMware friends are up to. Lots of good stuff over there. Anyhow, let's take the first topic and talk about bottleneck removal. So, my son was supposed to be sitting in this chair. Sadly, he is not. So I'm going to move it and then just adjust the camera so you can see more of me, which I'm sure is what you enjoy. So I was talking with someone yesterday. It's a favorite pastime when you work in a company to discuss yourself and what you do and to always be kind of learning from other people about how they talk about what your, as they say, your value proposition is, what the point of all of it is and things like that. And especially with a portfolio that's as comprehensive as Tanzu, it's fun to kind of think about what are people interested in? What do they respond to? What are the various types of conversations with people that you can have that is meaningful to them, right? That kind of helps out. I mean, this is a lot of what you do in marketing and sales and whatever you want to think of as developer relations is you're trying to figure out how to, in general, the things you have to offer you think are great and interesting and you know them well. And you're trying to figure out how to find the people who would be interested in that and explain it to them as well. You do this when you're an industry analyst as well, right? You try to find your audience and kind of match up how to explain things to them. Communicate. So I was going over this not going over. I was discussing it with some other people, and I was thinking, they were asking me how I tell the story of what we do, how I kind of try to have a slideless way of doing it, and I haven't really thought about it too much, but I think the story, the framing, whatever, the point of all the Tanzu stuff, of agile software development, of thinking about product stuff, is that in my experience, a lot of what we've done in IT and then software development is constantly trying to remove bottlenecks from the process. So I wasn't born at the time, but reading history and kind of knowing about it way back when, when IBM and others were trying to help the census out and help for better or worse, depending on whatever, help targeting out for military things. But computation was used to really speed up calculations that things were done, right? So you're removing this bottleneck of how long it would take to just do your calculations for your, artillery launches and things, but also for a lot of the big installs initially were all about, if I remember, basically so the government could figure out sending checks to people, whether it was for unemployment or social services or whatever you might have. A lot of stuff was for driving census analysis and doing what nowadays we would call back office stuff, like ADP stuff, and just accounting for that. And I think, that custom written software was large and probably delivered on a sort of a slow clip. And once we started moving to more, productivity things and just as software progressed, and definitely where we are nowadays, is there's been this series of bottlenecks that comes from someone having an idea of what software should be, figuring out what should be in that software, writing that software, testing it, and getting it into production and running it, right? I mean, this would be where a visual actually would be nice. But this is what custom written software is, those stages. And my understanding and what I've witnessed over the past 20 years is we're successively removing bottlenecks at each of those stages, right? And in fact, I might have a visual that I use, but I guess the whole trick was that you don't use a visual. But despite that, let me bring that up here. Let's see where I can find that. But what you're trying to constantly do, of course, is speed up that process, right? Make it faster. And I think there also is a concern of not only making something faster, but doing it with quality, right? And now I've kind of discussed that Deming has this different understanding of what quality is, and quality to him is a lot more close to what I would call product market fit from the lean startup area, right? That you're making a product or a software or a service that actually is useful to people, and it matches, it solves a need that they have or problem that they have in the way that they're doing. Whereas we in the software world, when we say the word quality, we think of it a lot more about not having bugs. And I think I was sort of in the let me go over to this diagram here. I was kind of, I think, in let's call it the mid tail end, which is kind of like, you read a recipe and it's mid high. That's kind of an odd, or high low, kind of an odd coding. But when I was in software, quality was still a big problem, right? It was hard to eliminate as many bugs as possible for the end result of software that you had. And I've always been at software vendors, so getting bugs out of your software is particularly important if you're selling software, because you'll spend a lot of money troubleshooting and fixing bugs. I remember I once spent basically a month trying to track down kind of a out of memory bug that was happening with one of our customers, and I don't think we ever found it. It just kind of mysteriously disappeared or was irrelevant at some point. But anyways, that sort of in itself is the first bottleneck that I think was around 2000 or so that Agile software first sought to remove from the process. Now this process here is not actually that great. I should make a new one because it even kind of represents how the bottleneck of quality was removed, of QA. And the way that bottleneck was removed, right? So it was a bottleneck because you would know what the requirements were, what features you wanted to have. Developers would write the software, and then it would have to go to someone else to be tested, right? So this became weight that you had. And that bottleneck was it wasn't so much removed, but it was improved by, as they like to say, shifting QA left, right? And what that means, right, is if you look at this, there's this constant, it took me a while to understand what people were saying when they were talking about shifting left. But if you imagine this arrow here, that used to be a QA function, and instead that shifted left over to code, right? So you had a lot of unit testing, a lot of functional testing, but software developers, they spent a lot of time figuring out how to automate testing. And they essentially took the mentality that they had for software development, which is basically a lot of software developers think how to generalize a solution to a problem and how to automate's the wrong word, but how to make the solution repeatable so that they don't have to solve the same problem over and over again. And with testing, especially manual testing, the problem is that you're doing the same kind of tests over and over again. And there were a lot of new ways to automate that testing, from heavy GUIs to web interfaces to kind of testing all the back-end code. And then you had test-driven development come about in unit tests. And not to get too detailed in it, but developers were able to automate that and speed it up and kind of move beyond that bottleneck. And then what we got to is that we could actually build software very rapidly. I mean, we could do it in a matter of a month or a couple of months rather than 12 months because we kind of removed, we could get to a complete build, to be specific, a build that had been developed and QA'd. And then around to use the phrase, the mid-late 2000s, the next bottleneck that we had was getting the code production ready, not only into production, but also packaging it up and configuring it and making it so that it could be in production, and then making it so that it could scale and basically run well in production. You could troubleshoot things. And this is where a lot of the, as it was called back then, web operations came from. And at some point, the idea of agile infrastructure was floated, and then it became known as DevOps, and it's kind of evolved a little bit into also, SRE and all these things. But again, the focus was that, as with when developers took over QA, took over is putting it to whatever, but as when QA shifted left, the idea was like, all right, so let's treat production as code, let's treat infrastructure as code, as people would say back then. And let's apply that same mentality to it of coding our way out of this drudgery and these problems. So that bottleneck was removed, right? And then, well, it was improved. And we've really spent a lot of our time constantly going through this cycle and focusing on removing those bottlenecks over and over again, right? And so containers come about, and you almost restart that process again, where because it's faster and easier to sort of package your software in a container and get it up and running, right? You can kind of run everything on your laptop as it used to go and kind of get a mocking up of what the final running end state of your software will be all on your laptop, because containers, because one, you don't really have to like file a ticket to spin up a lab for it. And they're so lightweight that as a developer, you can kind of create your own cloud on easy to get hardware, if not your own machine. But this again removes a bottleneck of setting up your environment and thinking about how you would set up the architecture for the distributed system. Now, the problem there becomes that then you're letting developers specify what that architecture looks like. And developers are especially bad at, despite what I was saying, coming up with their own way of doing things. And in a large organization, not generalizing to one way of doing things. You end up with all these sort of competing ways of architecting and running your applications rather than centralizing and standardizing on one way of doing it. So that became, then we reintroduced this whole thing of like, now that we have a different way of packaging and configuring applications, the software, the runtime environment, now we need to once again shift left all of the operational stuff, all of the sysadmin things to adapt to that new way of doing things, and also that speed of delivery that we can start delivering multiple times a week, and if not multiple times a day. So once again, we're introducing new methodologies and new technologies to remove that bottleneck, to remove that wait time that people would have. And we do this over and over again, where we have an improvement at some point in this process of getting software out the door. And the other, we almost locally optimize, right? The other nodes in this path haven't caught up to and haven't kind of adapted to the way that new fast-moving thing can operate. And I think if you look at what we do in the Tanzu land, what all of the other people in the cloud-native world are doing, right? They're constantly going in and trying to accelerate each of these little nodes. But the end point of that, again, going back to, whether it's like driving the census or sending out checks to people, or even, making your delightful videos where you can do your, what do they call it, a deep fake? There's a guy in my Instagram screen who's always grafting his face onto other things. But you're just trying to like close that loop of going from idea to coding to quality to QA to packaging to deployment, and make it as fast as possible and reliable as possible. And I think all the stuff that we have in our portfolio, and again, that other people have, is geared at that. So kind of, as always, understanding that complete chain and focusing on what are the bottlenecks, what are the wait times that we have, and always focusing on how you remove them is basically just like, that's just the way you do the entire process of software. And I'm not sure that will ever change, but just paying attention to what that life cycle is ultimately what you have. Now, there's a lot of parallel concerns here, and maybe we'll talk about it some other time, of basically governance or policy, as we'll get to. How do you make sure people are following the rules that you want or you're forced to follow? And then also, one of my favorite topics of sort of like technical debt, right? So how do you make sure that the debt that you're taking on isn't going to ossify you or make it impossible for you to improve in the future, right? How are you making sure that you're not taking shortcuts that will come back to haunt you in the future? That's what debt can be if you don't manage it correctly. Debt's great as long as you have a strategic plan for how you're going to not have that debt consume you and be the only thing that you're servicing. So, I think that's a way that I kind of start to understand what we're doing, all the way down to, the networking component you plug into Kubernetes, to the build pack stuff that you use to package up your software, to the way that you monitor things, to even like, the small batch cycle of studying the features that you have that work out best for people. It's all about figuring out how do we remove the bottlenecks and wait time from this process so that we can go through it as quickly as possible and constantly be improving and exploring and learning the way that we do software, which, is why a lot of the DevOps world draws on, if not completely stands on the shoulders of lean manufacturing and the constant learning and process that's built into that system. So before we get to the next topic, the strategy, let's do another little CTA, and that is, hi, are you a developer who's interested in learning about cloud native development? You know what you should do? You should go to tanzu.vmware.com/developer, and you can check out the growing list of resources. Resources, is that a word people use? That sounds like a business vacuous term there. But we have a collection of all sorts of, topic areas. It kind of reminds me of the old, to show my age, once again, I probably have to make a reference to J2EE once every episode. But it's similar to, where you would go on the server side and other famous places like that to kind of learn about what's going on. So, we've got an Agile Talk, doing event streaming, Kubernetes, all this stuff. And the team running this is doing a great job at collecting together all the material that we have sorted by that. But it's really worth your time if you're a developer trying to sort out what it means to operate in this kind of Tanzu cloud native world. You can get a sense and a lot of free training and education on that topic. Now, I'm supposed to be contributing to this agile category, but I'm not really getting around to it. To be honest with you, I need to tell them that I haven't figured that out. So sorry. So the next thing I wanted to go over is a little bit of what's in the last book that I wrote, the Business Bottleneck. And so what I wanted to write in this book was essentially like the concept that I started with when I was doing it year before last was that, speaking of a bottleneck, right? So once we get good at that the tech part of software, right? This to go back to it, this part where we are coding and doing the container build and all the production stuff and running and managing it, and even the product management part, which is still a pretty, at the moment, an IT-driven technical thing. There's a different bottleneck that we have way at the beginning here, which is the business, right? The people who are not in IT, who are kind of driving what they want that business to look like, who are not, and also driving the corporate strategy that organizations are following, and then also finance, is the steward of responsible investing in finance. And I think, in the same way that I was just going over, that at some point, development, I need to put a QA in here, but development and that hidden thing of QA. Here, let me just add that right here. You can see some of my mad PowerPoint skills. I go to a little insert, put a text box in here. QA. Now, for some reason, it thinks it's a good idea to do a light gray on a white background, which is clearly not what anyone would ever want. Let's use one of my Latin texts. Let's see if it has. I forget the name of it, but I have these great Amsterdam themed. Fonts. They're based on, like, if you're in Amsterdam, there's a lot of bridges, as you can imagine. And it's fun to go around and look at I don't know if you call it a font or a typeface, but the type that they use on bridges and everything else. Is actually, because, there's a big in the early 20th century, early 1900s, there was a big Art Nouveau style in Amsterdam. And you can see a lot of that still in existence. There's a fun seafood restaurant. In fact, why don't we look that up now? Amsterdam, what do they call it? It's Art Nouveau seafood. I forget the name of this place, but you don't see so many examples of this around town. But there's a particularly good one. Oh, there's the inside of it, but where's the outside? That's disappointing. I took a picture of it somewhere, but it'd probably take me way too. Oh, here we go. You can kind of see what it looks like. This is not a very good representation of it. Let's just open this in a new tab. I should find the what? Oh, there she is. No, I don't want to download it. I want to open image in new tab. Wow, it's really resistant to that. So let's just zoom in. So you don't see this very much. This is like the most Art Nouveau-y thing that you have. But this kind of style of typeface definitely shows up all the time. Let's see if there's the guy who came up with this font I'm using. He has a good study of this. Anyways, I'm getting distracted. The premise of this Business Bottleneck book was that there needs to be this shift right of the business side over here. Let me type this in. So you've got let's call it the business. See, look at that type. Isn't that nice? I really like what's going on there. We'll rotate this over, and we'll just say that even front loading this is is strategy and your line of business and finance. So there was this bottleneck even further, I think they would say upstream, where this group was not really aligned with the very engineered way of doing things, right? So they're on like a 12, even 18-month cycle of doing things. They don't really have that kind of small batch experimentation where you can use a fast development cycle to kind of explore what your customers want, to go through a discovery process, right? I mean, this is what you get. This is what it means to do things as a product, is you can constantly be putting out little new features, running experiments, and seeing if they solve users' problems or not. You can even explore what the problem is that you're looking to solve. And there's all sorts of, stories and use cases along that. So, what I did and wanted to do in this book is talk about, kind of try to educate the business side about the potential to use that small batch loop to operate the way that the rest of this, the downstream software cycle does, and kind of suggest how they should change to kind of contribute and help with that cycle. And what I wanted to highlight today was the kind of a little bit of the strategy section, and just one part of what how I think strategy could benefit from shifting right into development there. And now there's all sorts of things that a corporate strategy function is supposed to do. Classically, what a corporate strategy function is supposed to do, and if I remember, there's this great book, The Lords of Strategy, that's kind of the history of management consulting and corporate strategy, which it's a lot more interesting book than that description makes it out to be, because you really understand a lot of business history, and then because business is a big component of Western culture, a lot of Western culture and sort of life of the past 30, 40 years, when you kind of see how the lords of strategy have kind of influenced it and sorted it. But originally the goal of strategy was basically to figure out the way that a company can thrive given the assets that it has, or what assets it should acquire to thrive. And usually thriving just meant increasing valuation, paying out more dividends, which usually means driving revenue or driving efficiencies, but kind of figuring out that equation of how is this company more successful, which usually means getting more market share, which usually means getting more revenue, which usually means more profit, which usually means a higher valuation for your share price, and if you choose so, the ability to pay out a dividend. So how does an organization generate more money? And what I think what that amounts to is a lot of corporate strategy thinks about what business you should enter, and they don't necessarily pay attention to how that business should be entered and the tools that you should do. I don't know. I'm getting a little sidetracked, but I think one of the things that us in the tech world that also strategy does is they pay attention a lot to this curve, right? And this is a lot more of a kind of reactive function that I think corporate strategy should do, that whole left side of the software development cycle can contribute to. And it's, I don't know enough non-tech business to kind of draw out when this has happened. I mean, I guess, the old classic Netflix and Blockbuster thing is a classic example here. But I think that a lot of what corporate strategy needs to do nowadays is identify this point in their market curve. Now, what is this? This is one of my favorite strategy charts from Horace Dediu. And what it tracks is basically the demise of the PC and the rise of mobile. And what it's showing is way back when, the various types of PCs, this is the TRS-80 and the market share that they had, right? So back in the 70s, the TRS-80, or as people lovingly call it, the Trash 80, had a huge amount of market share, right? And you can see, Commodores and everything. And then eventually you can see this line is slowly creeping up, right? And that's, this is the Mac here. But the one that becomes even more significant is basically Microsoft, right? What we think of as the PC. And it climbs and climbs and climbs. And I don't really know what happened in 91. I forget. But all of a sudden, it's just the dominant platform, right? But then, almost, much more quickly than it happened, you see that its market share drops. Now, I remember witnessing this happening. And the thing that you would see from the PC people is they didn't really pay attention to this brown part here, right? To this brown on this green thing. They didn't consider it part of their market. Because they were phones, right? In the same way that infrastructure people used to talk about the bookseller in Seattle and how they weren't serious. And this is something, among many other things, that I think corporate strategy really needs to take on nowadays, when things can change so rapidly and things can be software driven, is that they need to be the ones who are keeping their eyes out for this, to say like, no, the bookseller is a threat, or no, it's not a phone. And then this is the great insight of this chart. You shouldn't think of it as a phone. You need to think of it as a PC, right? Like that phone in your pocket is a computer. And therefore, when we see new competition coming in, right, which is another function of strategy, is to focus on competition. But when we see competition coming in, we need to know who our competitors are. And we need to be able to make this chart that you see here that's showing that the definition of your market is changing and it's shifting. And therefore, we have something new to worry about. Now, historically, I think, what we used to call e-commerce was one of these things, right? And there was a time when about 5 or so years ago where like grocery delivery was considered to be something that couldn't have new competition or new ways of doing things. But what I think corporate strategy needs to spend a lot of time on is figuring out when their market gets redefined based on essentially competitors or new companies, new entrants coming in and using technology in a new way to redefine their market. Now, part of that is what's classically disruption theory, right? And just the classic uppercase D disruption theory being that competitors will emerge that use a cheaper, more limited offering, something that doesn't have as many features or as much quality or as much whatever that your current expensive option has, but is arguably, from your perspective, a worse product at a lower price. And they will slowly use that foothold, success in entering that part of the market that you've ignored, usually a lower end of the market that you just didn't service. And they'll start to become highly competitive in your area. And I think, you can see that effect. I think, with dollar stores and other things where they carve out that little niche of a market that's been ignored by bigger retailers in regions that bigger retailers wouldn't go to. And they start to build up on that success and they're kind of ignored. And then they're able to expand out and take over more and more of the market. So there is that type of disruption. But I think the other type to look out for is it's not that there's an inferior product at a lower price. It's just that your competitors are using technology to redefine the market that you're operating in. And I don't know, I'm not sure that corporate strategy, they probably want to do this, but I don't think that they are dependent on to do that as much as possible. And I think this is where the shifting right comes into play, is it's really hard, especially if you are in a strategy office and you have no budget for like traveling and going to actually talk with people and observe what your customers are doing, what your market is doing. Most corporate strategy people, I think, don't really like get out of the office and they just read reports from other people and they don't really like study what's going on in a market, which, if you've worked on software before, should sound very familiar. Most developers don't actually go out and look at how people are using their software and understand the problems that people are solving. Most of the managers of developers, even product managers who are in companies or people who are doing product management, they often, or business analysts, they don't really actually spend a lot of time observing what customers are doing, right? And in contrast, right, the companies that do it, there's some, I think I write that up in here as well, but there's a lot of, if you can piece it together, which I think I do for you in this book, which you can get for free if you go to kote.io/books or kote.pizza. But anyways, at the Home Depot, they've actually been pretty good, and they do have an advantage in that their stores are everywhere, but their teams actually do go in store to observe what customers are doing, what employees who use their software are doing. Anyways, in that same way, I would argue that strategy can shift right into having more direct observation of what customers are doing, right? Like if you think about the ability to deliver software on a weekly basis and doing product management well, where you do have development teams with product managers and designers going out into the field and doing things, strategy people should be joining those teams and observing and thinking about the problems that are being solved, the way the market could be redefined, the way that competitors are redefining that market, to get primary information instead of just some reports that the summer interns at one of the big consulting firms are sort of doing for them. There's a lot of outsourcing in corporate strategy, which seems, I don't know. outsourcing of strategic functions, ironically, of strategy, is often an unwise idea. I think you're just kind of getting the same boiled up PDFs and ideas that other people have gotten as well. It's good to consult with people, but I would also I would have as much primary research on your own as you outsource. So the whole thing is, how can strategy identify these, people like to say inflection points, but identify when the market gets redefined? And I think how they can start doing that is they can get more involved in the firsthand experience of going through this loop, right? Actually, they don't have to do it constantly or work on it, but they need to shift left into the production and thinking about that software. And you can see more writing up of that kind of in the Business Bottleneck book there. So speaking of, are you interested in getting some help kind of bootstrapping and kickstarting how you're going to do this process? A lot of what I talk about here and what customers ask about is, we all know that I should be focusing on the right priorities and kind of put my portfolio together and modernize my software. But what framework do I use to start that? How do I put together that kind of Eisenhower matrix of the 4-quadrant matrix of what I should do? How do I even understand what matters? Which is a surprisingly difficult thing for people in large organizations. So we, of course, because we're interested in you working with us more, whether it's in the Pivotal Labs front with the kind of the consultative training that we do, or the Tanzu Stack, the software that we sell and help put in to do all of your dreams, basically, as I was talking about at first. We'll do like an hour workshop with you or a half day one, depending on how things pan out. But if you're interested in that, kind of getting, someone other than myself, but kind of going through that process that, for example, Mark Zotner started to go through us week before last, and Robbie Clutton has kind of walked us through. And even Rohit, if you remember quite some time ago, there's this process that you go through to figure out what your application modernization strategy is. And our goal, of course, is to do a little bit of consulting and services, but our real goal is to get the stack of software and technology in place that allows you to focus on that modernization. Which is to say, this is not like one of those outsourcing things I was kind of bemoaning earlier. We're going to take over doing all that for you in a 5-10 year plan where we optimize our costs at the downfall of your benefit. Instead, we're looking to help kick off and train up how you're doing things. But you can go, if you're interested in doing that, you can go to kube.pizza, where I like to list all sorts of references that I have. You can also, that's where you can get a copy of the Business Bottleneck that I was just talking about. But you can see software office hours. If you click on that, you can just sign up, put your information in there, and you can start talking with us to start putting your strategy together for those things. So the next thing I want to go over is, I don't really have much of anything to do about this, but it's something that I think about often, which is that it's this idea, the quip of the episode, if you will, is that, policy is made by humans, right? I think a lot of, let me mark that up as the quip of the episode. I remember, quip of the episode. What would that be? The quattro? What was the name of that guy? And let's look that up. Total Recall Quaid? Now Quaid was the guy, but who was the little guy? The kind of mutant guy in there. I forget what his name was. What was his open your mind? Quattro? There you go. I think I'm going to say that that's pronounced Quato. Quato? Yeah, whatever. But, you're always running up against filing expenses and your HR policy. And even with, if you think about your consumer services, right? Like people, you'll want to do something different with the services that you have. And they'll say, oh, it's just, we don't allow that. It's just policy that we have. And I often, governance is like this as well, right? When people are trying to optimize the way that they're doing software, they're trying to be more agile and product driven, all the stuff we talk about here. Governance is always an issue that comes up, right? Just the security people don't allow this. The governance people say we need to audit and log this, or we have to pass this gate of manual review and creation of some project management governance thing. And like the thing about a lot of that, some of it comes from contractual agreements and laws and regulations that you just have to follow, which we'll get back to shortly. But a lot of that is just governance and policy that the organization has made up, just ideas they've had over time. And as an example, I think I've used this reference before, but I forget. I think this was referenced in that wonderful discussion series, Beyond the Phoenix Project, with John Willis and Gene Kim, kind of just in a structured way, just kind of contemporaneously, just kind of talking about DevOps theory. But they use an example of, I forget her name, but someone at Target who, at Target, they had a policy that you had to go through a very thorough review process to introduce a new framework. I think I'm going to get details of this wrong, but you had to file a TPS report, so to speak. You had to file a request to bring together to convene the governance board. Then you had to basically go over what your new framework was and defend it and be asked questions about it. Then that board had to go off and decide if you could have the framework or not. And this person, what she had was the insight to ask, why are we doing this? What's the reason that we're going through this process? How did this come about? What problem are we solving? Why does this policy exist? And I'm sure this discussion went on for a long time, but the end result was that no one really knew why they were following that policy. And they decided to follow this quattro or whatever, this quip of the episode. They realized that they could just decide not to do it because there was really no reason other than that they were following it, right? Policy is just made by humans. And I think a lot of the time what you encounter when there's some policy that you're butting your head up against that's saying no to you, right? It's because some people have decided to put that policy in place. Now, as I disclaimed at the beginning, in a group setting, in a work environment, a lot of policy is also set that specifies what proper behavior is, how not to be a jerk or just do things that are bad and terrible, which is a whole other category of policy, setting positive norms than I'm talking about here. But I would encourage you, whenever you're coming up against governance, one, if you're the person who's not in charge of that policy, you've got to be very careful, right? You can't just go about like a naive engineer would and talk about why it's bad and come up with a proof of why it's terrible, but start to befriend and be empathetic and kind of figure out who's in charge of that policy and enforcing it, and just slowly or at the proper rate start to figure out who made this policy up, who's in charge of it, what do they need to hear, what would make sense to them to talk about if this policy is required anymore, if we could change it, how do we kind of have that discussion of why we have it there? Because after all, policy is just made by people. It's not some immovable rock that's out there. Like I said, not a fully fleshed out idea, but I think that is kind of something to consider in the mindset, kind of mind shift way of thinking about things. That's the book I'm vaguely starting to work on now. Well, I've already done my little CTAs for where you should go. In summary, you should go check out kube.academy, check out our developer site there, as you can see. And if you're really interested in the next steps and more, you can go to the discovery workshop that we have. You can get to all of that and the show notes for this episode and the archives that we have, not only the daily shows, but also interviews that I've done with people, right? I referenced talking with Robbie and Rohit and Mark to get a sense of the kind of process that you start with to really kind of chart out the strategy for your digital transformation. But if you go to kote.io/Tanzu Talk, you can see all of that. And I always appreciate hearing feedback about how things have been going with this and any topics you're interested in. And with that, I'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.